Welcome to a room full of pros and cons with your hosts, John Askew and Tim Stark.
So, John, where did it all start for you musically?
I grew up in a household that was always pretty, full of music. I'm one of 5 kids. My older brothers and sisters were always playing music, and through them I sort of inevitably got into the music that they were listening to, which was stuff like the Smiths, the Cramps, AC/DC, In Excess. And then when I was at school around 12 years old, I was trying to persuade my parents to let me take up the drums. I really wanted to play the drums, and my mum and dad, and I wanted to be the drummer in a band. And by that stage, I was listening to like the Beastie Boys' first album, License to Ill, and Guns N' Roses' first album, Lies, and sort of the beginnings of Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction, early Cult stuff, Cult Electric. And so I really wanted to play the drums, and my mum and dad were like, no, it's just too noisy. So we compromised on the guitar, and then I got into playing guitar, was obsessed with rock, especially like the Cult, Guns N' Roses, and just started playing in bands and stuff. So I'd say, my obsession with music definitely started with rock and hard rock, with bands like the Cult and Guns N' Roses.
And was there one track that you had the most? What was the first track that had a really profound meaning for you? Say, kind of 7 to 10 type of thing.
Good question. The Cult Love Removal Machine, I would say, was huge for me, and Guns N' Roses, Mr. Brownstone. Those 2 records were, and also Guns N' Roses' Night Train. I think those 3 tracks, and they still today, they'd be in my top 10.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And transitioning from rock to rave is it's not unheard of, but it's pretty unusual, isn't it? How did that happen?
Well, I grew up in or near to, and it was the town that I kind of grew up in, a place called Marlborough, and at that time everyone was there was a big contingent of people who were in rock bands, and then there was also a lot of people going to raves. Wiltshire, where Marlborough is, being one of the epicenters of the illegal rave scene when it first blew up in the late 80s, early 90s. I didn't get into electronic music until probably about 1993 or 1994. And I think this is pretty well documented, but I'd had a big fallout with the band that I was in at the time. And some friends of mine were going to a rave in Cornwall, encouraged me to come with them. I was completely against it, long hairs, leather, but went to this rave, which was really underground, with a DJ called Easy Groove playing.
The Techno Dread.
Yeah, that's right. And I went to this thing, and took ecstasy for the first time in my life, and was just exposed to an entirely different way of going out. Whereas you go out and rock and roll, and it's everyone getting pissed and fighting, and this was unbelievable. And I remember watching the DJ and going, fuck, he's not just putting records on, he's putting a record on, queuing it up, deciding that it's not the right record for that moment, changing it, getting the next one, and then the effect it was having to the crowd. And he was really working the crowd, not just what I perceived a DJ to do was just put record on after record on, but the way he was mixing them, the way he was blending them. And then I just started really getting into going out to raves, some illegal raves and free parties, and some clubs. Started really getting into going to Club UK, Final Frontier, which was the Friday night at Club UK in Wandsworth. And this was now my new obsession. And
Did you put on raves, or were you how immersed in the scene were you?
We did go on to put on raves. We started a night called Code Red. We put on some raves in a few different places in Wiltshire, on the Ridgeway, up at East Ilsley, and a few other spots. But then we also started doing nights in London. First at a place called Woody's in kind of Notting Hill area, Westbourne Park, and then
So this would have been kind of 94, 95 type of time, or was it earlier?
yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, I started DJing. I think I bought my first decks because, funnily enough, I've still got the slip, when the receipt. I think in 1994, and I think the first parties we would put on were probably 1995, but then the first club things we were doing, I think, were back end of 95, early 96. And then basically we it didn't really get going until we moved south of the river to Brixton and started putting parties on at places like the 414 on Cold Harbour Lane, and my mate, it was always me and my friend Zach putting on parties together, and another friend of ours called Ed. And then Zach's musical tastes took a more kind of eclectic, more left field direction, French disco and stuff. And the thing we were doing together was called Code Red, and he started something called Deep Blue, and he went more into the George IV, which was further up in Brixton. But yeah, we were always putting on parties south of the river in London.
And this would have been after the times of things like Shimmy and kind of Club UFO and things like that in Wiltshire. Yeah. Yeah,
the UFO Club, and then do you know what? The UFO Club I used to go, so for the purposes of explaining, the UFO Club was a big rave that was legal, a ticketed event at Longleat, so the place that is now a big, wildlife park and zoo. The huge stately home there, which was owned by the Marquis of Bath, they used to put on these fucking colossal raves there, and there was a nightclub on the side called Oscars, which was probably about 1,000 people, and then there was the Barclays Suite, which was 1,500 people. And they would put on these massive raves there, and we would go there just as punters. But later on, further in, towards the back end of the 90s and the early noughties, I actually got to meet the people who ran the night, Shane Thompson and Andrew Pennell, and eventually started DJing for them and sort of had a bit of a residency there. But my residency for them was sort of towards the tail end of it.
Right. Okay.
But it was amazing. They were great parties.
And what was the music policy like at places like Shimmy and Final Frontier at the time? What were you...
Techno and hard trance, acid trance. At the UFO Club, you'd have people like Dave Clark, Carl Cox, Eat Static, Tintin. It was that sort of... It was always underground, Billy Nasty, techno and underground trance, and I would say the same sound in Shimmy in Bristol.
Right.
Yeah.
So, what would the biggest time you were kind of... There was stuff going on in Bristol. Mm-hmm. There was stuff going on in your kind of like home area, Warminster, and there was stuff going on in London. Was that all happening around the same time?
Yeah, it was.
Or was Bristol your kind of London before London? How did that work?
No, it was happening around about the same time. Yeah, it was. So we would do swaps. Like I would go and play for Shimmy or Strange Fruit. Strange Fruit was another massive techno and trance rave in Bristol, really big. And so I would go and play for them, and then their DJs would come and play for us in London. We were always predominantly in London, and but yeah, it was sort of between the three areas, and then it wasn't till and then I was at university. I went to Brighton University, so while I was at Brighton University, I was playing a little bit down there as well, but still going up to do our shows in London. Yeah, it was all three were going simultaneously. Yeah.
And when you were at university, what were you studying? And how quickly after you finished did you make the decision that music was the way to go?
I mean, I knew I wanted to make music my career when I was 12 years old. Initially wanting to be a guitarist in a rock band and then moving on to DJing, but I was always focused on it, and I saw school and education as just a complete fucking waste of time, that I just wanted to get on with what I knew was going to be my career. I'm glad I didn't do that, by the way. I'm glad I did stick it all through and get the qualifications, etc., in case my kids are watching this.
What did you do?
I did at university. I did management and tourism, which I know seems like a bit of a weird thing, but in the old days, the UCAS book, which told you all the courses at all the universities, down the right hand side of the book, it had different coloured tabs, and one of those tabs, with different bits of information. One of those tabs was average number of hours per week. And so I flicked through until I got the lowest number I could find, and it was management and tourism at Brighton University.
Well, if you think to yourself that you work in management now, and you spend a lot of time traveling internationally, it's not the worst. Looking back, it's funny how things come around, and it's not the bad.
I can't remember a goddamn thing from that course, but I met some great people, had some great times. I did pass it. I got a 2-1. And but travel and tourism and immersing myself in other people's cultures and food and way of life, etc., is something that has been a big component of my life. I really, really enjoy it. I love going and experiencing things, especially from a local's perspective at a street level in different parts of the world.
So you have previously cited your biggest electronic music heroes as being DJ Dag, CJ Bolland, Wes Bam, Gail Sand, Billy Nasty, Sven Vath, Laurent Garnier. Could you talk a little bit about what each of those brought to you in terms of inspiration and influence?
Yeah, DJ Dag was my biggest influence, and Gail Sand to an extent, but she, 3 years into me being obsessed with her and the DJ sets that she was playing at Final Frontier at Club UK, which is basically where I discovered both of them, DJ Dag and Gail Sand. Dag played a sound that was, trance music first exploded predominantly out of Germany. It was a sound that had clearly been imported from, or elements of it been imported from Goa. And, labels like IQ Records, Heart House, Frankfurt Beat, Time Unlimited, Prolocult was English, that was Red Jerry's label, but it was still an important label at that time. No Respect Records, but predominantly the best music of the sound that I liked was coming out of Germany, focused around clubs like Dorian Gray and The Omen, and DJ Dag was at the absolute tip of the spear with Sven Vath as well of that sound. And when we used to go to Club UK, you'd often have one room was a lot more techno and one room was a lot more trance, and I would always go to the room that was more trance. I liked the melodies and stuff, but Dag's sound was a bit tougher and a bit more well produced than other people who were on that circuit playing at the same time. He and Gail Sand, I mean, if ever there was a lineup, and they used to do this quite often, which was Dag 4 hours, Gail Sand 4 hours, and that was the night. It was just like my wet dream. So Dag was the one that really made me, that was the sound I wanted to DJ. That was the sound I wanted to DJ. And then CJ Bolland, his album The Fourth Sign, which was 1994 on R&S Records out of Belgium, he's English born, but essentially Belgian. That album still remains my favorite electronic album of all time. It was the album that sort of made me entertain the idea of falling in love with techno as well. Very percussive, very high energy, high BPMs, incredible album. Still, yes, okay, it's 1994 production, but it still stands the test of time today. And when I heard that album, it made me sort of want to spend a bit more time in the techno room as well, and understand that it's not just the same thing happening over and over and over again. It's losing yourself in those hypnotic rhythms, but also how the DJ is layering them on top of each other to create more big moments of intensity. So I would say that Dag was my biggest influence in terms of the sound I wanted to play. CJ Bolland, the sound that he was producing, and especially on that album, The Fourth Sign, made me sort of understand a more harder percussive sound. And it was an amalgamation of those two that were forged together that made me create the sound that I would say is my sound.
So with The Fourth Sign, there's probably going to be people out there who've heard it many, many times, and maybe some people they're hearing about it for the first time. What track or tracks from that would you point as being the kind of gateway to CJ Bolland and those other guys?
Yeah, Camargue was the big hit. It was the big single with those ethereal chords. But my favorite track on the album was Spring Yard, which was very fun. Like, I think it was 150 beats per minute. He had it was every kick drum that hit in between in the offbeat part, he had a reverse kick drum, which gave it this sound that was like da-fut, 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 which I went on and stole in quite a few tracks that I made afterwards. But that track was amazing. Loved hearing it. Every time I heard that in a club, I was just like, wow, this is so good. And there was another track called Nightbreed.
Yeah, fantastic.
Those two, but there's not a track on that album that I don't adore, that I love it. I can listen to it over and over and over again, much to the dismay of my friends and family who were sick of it.
And you remixed him last year, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
So how did that come about?
Well, I always wanted to remix that track. There Can Be Only One, which I made it. I reached out to him. He didn't reply. I reached out to him again. He didn't reply. And then I sent him a long email with a picture of me holding The Fourth Sign, the vinyl that I used to DJ out, which was now sellotaped up on this corner, gaffer tape on this corner, the vinyl's still falling out the bottom. It was fucked, right? And I sent it to him saying, look, mate, I am the biggest fan you're ever going to meet. Here is the record that I did circuits with forever that is just fucked. This is not just someone reaching out to you out of nowhere. You made me the artist I am. And then he sent a really lovely reply back, said, all right then, go on then. Yeah.
Sometimes that's what it takes.
Yeah.
It is what it takes.
Yeah.
So just coming back very quickly to Final Frontier, which was amongst, just one of those early 90s seminal, just as it's kind of going from illegit to legit club nights. You played the final one.
Yes, I did, yeah.
What was that like? I mean, apart from being very emotional, I imagine.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Did you know it was the final one?
Yeah, we did. Yeah. We did. They subsequently... So there were 3 rooms there. You went into the... essentially it was a club that was on the side of an NCP car park in Wandsworth. And you would queue up, and then you'd go up some stairs. You'd come into the first room, which I think was traditionally called the Shangri-La. And it was a nightclub. Then you go through to a second room, which was small, which was the room where we played, which is more maybe 250, 300 people. And then you go through the next part, which was the huge room at the back, which was maybe 2,000 people. And that was essentially just part of the actual car park that they'd walled off. So it sort of, had markings on the floor that were still car park, right? Very underground, very industrial, but some of the best nights of my life were in there. So to be asked to, we got to know the people behind it, people like Matt Tangent and Paul, I can't remember his surname, Paul and what was the other guy, Jenkins, who actually was either married to or going out with Gail Sand. But we kind of got to know them just by being in the club every week, and then Matt Tangent got us the gig doing Code Red in the middle room on the last ever, and it was amazing. All our friends were there who had been there at every night. It was fucking magical.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
So, how did your employment or your relationship with Ministry start?
So after university, I moved to London.
So this would be 97 or 96?
Yeah, 97, 98, something like that. Is that right? I can't work it out.
It's mind plays tricks.
Yeah, no, around that period, let's say. And I moved, maybe it was 98 actually. And yeah, it was, but I'll tell you why. Because after university, I actually went and lived in a rundown house in the middle of the countryside with 2 or 3 other mates. That was an amazing time. The house, they were going to demolish the house because it had no heating, no damp course. It was infested with rats. And they said, look, we can't charge you any money to stay here because technically it's not livable. It was like living in a squat, really, but we'll let you live here for a tokenary £50 a month. All of us were paying that, not each, but collectively. So it was like a tenner each or something. I mean, there were times when there were 5 of us living there, times when there were 3, but we had an amazing time there. And then I went to uni after that, went to Brighton University. And when I finished my degree, I moved up to London and I was looking for a job. And I got a job working for Loot, which I guess was a sort of pre-eBay free ads newspaper where people would put adverts for selling their sofa or their guitar or their car or anything. You could sell anything in Loot. And I had a shit job there for a year maybe. And I was frantically going to loads of interviews for jobs in the music industry and wasn't getting anywhere. I did do maybe 4 or 5 months working for Chrysalis Records, who were looking after Moloko, Feeder, various sort of bands around, and they were signing a lot of kind of liquid drum and bass and stuff. That was great. I was just the tea boy. Mark Almond was there as well. I was just the tea boy making tea and shit, but learnt a little bit about the A&R process. Was going out with one of their A&R scouts to see bands and stuff. And then I had 2 mates who were already working at Ministry of Sound. And so I was hanging out with them, going and clubbing with them, and I was constantly pressurizing them to get me a job at Ministry. And then eventually this job did come up, which I was so not qualified for. And
which was?
It was working in radio syndication, which was essentially selling radio shows to radio stations around the world.
Right.
And so I slightly fabricated my CV a little bit to
it was a different time.
Yeah. I just it made my sales history a little bit more extensive, a little bit more impressive. And so I got the interview and I went in and I did the interview, and the interview went well, but I think they asked a couple of questions where I think they could see perhaps he's not, qualified enough for this role. And then at the end of the interview, when I saw that was the vibe, I said, look, you might have your reservations about me, but I can tell you this, I can sell fucking anything to anyone. And I guarantee you, whatever, the predecessor who's just left, whose boots I'm going to have to fill, I will smash his targets. I guarantee you I will smash his targets within 2 months of being here. And they just sort of looked at me and then they said, all right, you start Monday. And
that's the way it goes sometimes.
And I went in there and it was terrifying. But it was super exciting. It was at a time when Ministry was flying and vinyl hadn't died yet. And and they were doing a lot of physical, selling a lot of CDs, a lot of vinyl. It was the vibe in the office was so vibey. There was lots of interesting people, and I was just loving it. I was thriving off it. It was an amazing time to have joined the industry, because there was a dark cloud looming, and it was coming, which was the death of physical and the birth of MP3 and WAV formats, and with that piracy and just, so many people went under at that point. But initially, it was a magical time to have joined the music industry.
And that would have then led you into the club and DJing there, I would imagine. Is that how it?
Yeah, they had they put on a club night at Ministry. So the offices, Ministry of Sound, are where the club is as well. They had a couple around the corners as well, and they put on a staff night. Not only staff could go to it, the public were welcome to go to it, but it was only staff DJing at it, with maybe a couple of headliners, a couple of Brandon Blocks and Alex P's maybe. But and so I had a gig playing at that. I played at it, and one of the people who was working in Ministry of Sound tours, who was responsible for the big Ministry show coming up at New Year's Eve at the Dome, then said to me, look, we want, first of all, do you want a residency at the club? And I was like, fucking right. And second of all, do you want to come and play at the Dome on the main stage in front of 20,000 people? It's not, you're not going to be on the flyer, and you're not going to have a fixed set time, but there are a lot of people like Ferry Corsten, Tiesto, and all these other DJs who have got 3 gigs on that night, and there's a chance they might be late or they might need to leave early. So it might be like 10 minutes here, 15 minutes here. And I was like, yeah, 100%. So, and that's what happened. I went, and I think I played one slot for 20 minutes, one for 45 minutes. But I was there kind of in amongst all these big rock stars like Ferry and Tiesto. And then afterwards, they said, right, we want you to start playing at the club once a month. And then I got involved in this night at Ministry called Future. And that's where it really started to take off.
And then I guess that must have been a very good calling card when Turnmills was kind of coming into the frame.
Yeah. Turnmills was a cooler night. So the gallery was Friday nights at Turnmills. Turnmills was just up the road across the river into Farringdon, and it was cooler. I used to go there and watch Tall Paul and Paul Oakenfold, and it was fucking awesome. It was kind of like an intimate, maybe 1,000 capacity across the 2 rooms. But the main room was probably only about 700 people, but they had the biggest DJs in the world playing there, Van Dyke and everyone. And then I got a gig playing in Los Angeles, the first ever time I played in Los Angeles, which was 2001 or 2, I can't remember. And that night got recorded, and the recording of this 3-hour set that I got found its way into the hands of Danny Newman, Tall Paul's brother, yeah. Paul Newman. Found it into his hands, and he reached out to me through a mutual friend and asked me to come down for a beer. And I went and met him, and he said, look, man, I want you to leave Ministry of Sound and come and be resident here at the gallery. I was like, fucking right, yeah, okay. So I did that, and I had maybe 5 amazing years, must have been 4 or 5 amazing years playing at the gallery monthly. Some incredible nights there, and the freedom to sometimes go on till 3 or 4 hours after the scheduled closing time because they had a 24-hour license. Some of the best nights I can remember.
So, favorite club in the world to play in right now, and favorite club over the span of the last 30 years?
My favourite club that I've ever played in is a club in Buenos Aires called Niceto, and I haven't played there for many years because it's the promoter who was doing the nights there has now moved to a bigger club called Groove, which is almost double the capacity of Niceto. And I love playing Groove because it almost is. Niceto is like a mini version of Groove, but there's something about Niceto that is really magical. It's intimate. It's 1,000 people, 900, 1,000 people. It's so intense, and I've had some of the best, DJing experiences in that. And what was the second question? That
Over the course of the time, 30 years, your favourite club?
probably still Niceto.
Really?
Same
Wow.
same club for both.
Okay. Now, I know the answer to this question already, but I don't think it's too widely broadcast. What is the worst club that you have played in? I'll give you 2 words as a feeder. German bikers.
Yeah, well, I can't remember the name of it, but it is that club.
It's probably the club that has no name now.
It has the. So yeah, I used to play a night in London called Eurobeat 2000, and I met a kid there who came up to me after my set and said, "Look, man, I love your music. I love what you were playing." And Eurobeat 2000, it was just techno, no trance, just techno, very Detroit influenced techno night. Although I was playing more a European sound, but it was 100% techno. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, "I want you to come and play my dad's club in Germany," which I can't even remember where it was. I think it may have been in Cologne or... And so I went, okay, yeah, I'd love to. I wasn't really playing a lot internationally. And so I went over to this night, got picked up, went to the hotel. And then when I went to the club, I pulled up outside and it was just fucking hundreds of Harley Davidsons lined up outside. And I was like, oh my God, what is this? Went in and it was the DJ booth had, like mesh over it to stop flying bottles. And the DJ before me was playing AC/DC and I was like, oh my God, this is not going to go well. And I put the first track on. And there were just guys in the crowd, everything, the whole place just stopped. And I was playing like rolling European techno. And the only person who was dancing was the son of this guy who was in the middle of the dance floor on his own, just going like this. Everyone else on the dance floor was staring at me. And then this guy went like this. He went like that to me like that. And I just grabbed my bag, left that record playing, but grabbed my bag, went out, fucked off, went to the hotel, got my shit and went back to the airport.
It was the only course of action at the end of the day, wasn't it?
I thought, I'm about to die here. I don't need this sort of shit. I'm not going to stand here for 2 hours, and I don't care whether you pay me or not. I'm just getting the fuck out of here.
Sometimes enthusiasm can run away with people, I guess that's what happened with this lad. So a bit of a sidebar question. Where did you meet your wife? How many years has it been now, and where are you at with family?
I met my wife in that sort of squat style house that I was living in. One of my mates who moved in temporarily for about 6 months, he was seeing a girl who is my wife's best friend. And I met her through her. That was the very first time we met, but we were both in relationships. There was no, it wasn't even on the cards. But we met that night and we sort of said hello and stuff. And then later on, when I was working at Ministry, I'd split up from my girlfriend at the time, and she'd gone traveling to Latin America. And I had an amazing summer of going to loads of festivals and, doing the things you do when you've just come out of a 5-year relationship. And then at the end of the summer, when we went into winter, I was sitting in my flat in Tooting in South London, and I was just like, fucking hell, this is depressing. I was on a big come down from an amazing summer. And so I sent an email out to all my mates with the subject "girlfriend wanted," and with a joke kind of list of stuff that I couldn't even repeat now, but it was a piss take. It wasn't a serious thing. It was me sort of more kind of saying, fucking hell, does anyone want to go to the pub for a drink? I'm just really low here, down in Tooting. And then my mate Donna replied and said, yeah, I know exactly the person for you. And she connected us, and here we are 23, 24 years later.
And family?
Yeah. I have my son, Tom, who's 17, and my daughter, Maisie, who's 14. Yeah. And they're both absolutely amazing.
Chances of you, in the fullness of time, passing the stadium reins to one, other, or both? Can you see that as a possibility in either of their futures? Or is that something you would even want for them to kind of like follow into the music industry?
It's a good question. I wouldn't want to prevent them from doing anything they wanted to do, and I would encourage and always support them, whatever path they want to choose. There's good bits and bad bits to being a touring artist, and I'd be wary of the bad bits, but perhaps if they did it and I was managing them, whether that would work or not, or whether that would compromise our relationship, mixing business and family, I don't know. But they're both passionate music lovers. They both really love music, and I would do everything I could to support them if that was a path they wanted to go down. But I think they also see, or they also get a considerably compromised not relationship, but amount of time with me, because of how often I'm away and how full on the job is. I am either working in London most of the time or on the road a lot of the time. And quite often, if I'm not, and I'm home at the weekends, I would say 1 in every 3 weekends, I'm still having to spend the whole weekend in the studio making music as well. So my time with my kids is massively compromised. It's something I'm very aware of. I feel incredibly guilty about, and I wish I could change. But it's the nature of the profession I've chosen, and I try and talk my way around it, saying, well, if you were in the army, you'd be away 9 months. But that's something I would make them think about if they were deciding to go down this route.
So how many weeks or weekends away are you spending in, say, 2023 comparative to what you were doing 10 years ago?
Well, now I mostly do 1 weekend with 2 gigs once a month. That's what I'm trying to do right now. It sometimes is a little bit more. Like if you go to Australia or if you go to Asia, sometimes it needs to be 2 weekends. To avoid doing 2 trips. But predominantly, I would say this year will end up being something like 16 or 17 weekends with 2 shows per weekend. So something along those lines.
After the first years of electronic music, it was everybody needed to get a hand from someone in the industry. Who were the people that kind of like got behind John Askew in the earliest years as you were kind of like forming a career in DJing and production? Who were the people who were putting you on the airwaves, putting you on their playlist?
Fergie was a massive supporter. When he got his show at Radio 1, he was playing my records on Radio 1, and he was obviously a regular at the gallery at Turnmills. Turnmills themselves were, or the gallery themselves were massive supporters, because they were getting me interviews in DJ Mag and Mix Mag and was it called ID magazine? What was that?
M8, and there was ID, and there was Wax Music.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, all of those, their PR and press team got me shitloads of interviews, which gave me a bit more presence. And then I'd say Paul Van Dyke was a big supporter of my earlier records. And that relationship sort of continued when he had his show on Fritz FM in Berlin. He was playing my tracks on a regular basis. I would say a combination of those, probably.
it wasn't actually until I started researching for this podcast that I spotted that you'd done an Essential mix in 2007. And initially I was a little bit kind of, how on earth did I miss that? But it was also one that kind of took place outside of the first blaze of, kind of trances. It was a less usual time. So
Yeah.
to get one of those. So how did that come about? And how did you go about preparing for it, if you can?
Well, I was being managed by Judge Jules's company, Sirius, and Charlie, who was my manager, he was also Jules's manager, he was also Simon Patterson's manager. He managed to get it for me, and I think
Was it something you were aware he was pushing for?
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about it. I was really, it was something I was desperate to do because it's such an iconic thing. And I don't consider the Essential Mix to just be mixing 25 tracks together. It was more, you would approach it in an entirely different way. You'd use sections from movies and try and make this sort of almost like, it's like you're scoring a film. So I would approach it in an entirely different way, and I was ever so grateful that he got it for me. And I had this, I mixed it on decks, but then kind of loaded it into Logic and was adding additional stuff here and there. And it was quite a interesting sort of process. But when I delivered it to Radio 1, they messaged me back and said, "You've recorded it in mono." And I was like, "What?" And they said, "You've recorded the whole set in mono. It's in mono." I was like, "No, you can't be." And they said, "Not only have you recorded it in mono, but we need you to re-record it in stereo, and we need it delivered to BBC Radio 1 by 11 o'clock tomorrow morning." So I stayed up all night trying to get it as good as it was the first time. No sleep, straight on the train, got it to them with half an hour to spare. But yeah, it was an amazing moment, and I'm very proud that is on my CV because the Essential Mix for me, in those old days especially, I don't know whether it's still got such a strong resonance now or whether people just see it as a DJ mix. But
I don't think it can possibly have.
No.
Yeah.
But for our generation, certainly the Essential Mix was the pinnacle.
Yeah, truly. Yeah, it was. So while we're talking about radio, it's probably a good time to talk about the radio department and how that enterprise started, and how it came about, the history, and how difficult it was eventually to leave it behind.
So when I blagged my way into the radio department at Ministry of Sound, I then went on to have 2 or 3 years working at Ministry of Sound, working initially in radio syndications, which was selling and distributing radio shows on a weekly basis to different countries equivalent of BBC Radio 1, let's say, right? So putting radio shows on radio stations around the world. And I was working there with various different people, but one guy, Gavin Kingsley, would go on to be my business partner later on. At the end of my time there, I then left to do more or less the same job for Carl Cox, who was with Cosmac Management under another company called Trust the DJ. I went and worked for them for maybe a year and a half, and Gavin Kingsley was there. He'd left Ministry of Sound before me and gone and started their radio thing over there. So I went and joined that. And then when that company was coming to an end, Gavin and I said, look, instead of going and working for another company's radio department, why don't we just set up the radio department, which is what we did. And then we just started signing loads of different artists. We worked with everyone. David Guetta, Armin van Buuren's still there, Adam Beyer, Paul Oakenfold, Carl Cox, John Digweed. And it was glorious. We had that company for 15 years. It's still going really strong. And I saw Gavin actually on Friday night at Junction 2 Festival in London. But it just got to the stage where I was, I don't know, I can't explain necessarily why, but I just wanted out. I wanted out of it. I was finding it hard to sell terrestrial radio as a concept to people in an ever-increasing digital on-demand world. To sit there and be selling this stuff. It's not to say that it's not important, but I don't know. It wasn't the only thing. I was also like wanting to do other stuff, and I was getting more and more involved in management. By the time I sold that, my half in that company, I was already managing Simon Patterson, Paul Oakenfold, and I just thought, I'm just more interested in this. So I got out.
And what is your relationship with radio generally now? When you have the time to listen to you, are there stations that you'll still go to, or is it now Spotify or another medium?
It's probably a mix of everything. I love Six Music. Six Music is predominantly my favourite station. It plays the music that is maybe most appropriate for my own tastes and my demographic. And I don't mean, that music is targeted at a demographic, but what I mean is there's moments of nostalgia playing tracks that were the tracks that you loved when you were in your late teens and early 20s. But I think Six Music is probably the station that I listen to the most. It's the one that's on all the time in the Askew family household. And radio in general fascinates me. It always did, and that's why I went in that career path. Is that true? Or did you just bullshit your way into Ministry of Sound and then ended up going in that direction? But I just loved the idea of radio, that it could be one person and a microphone talking, and there would be people all over the country listening at that one moment. I was just fascinated by that concept as a kid. And so, and now with the internet, you can tune into radio stations from all over the world. So I like, FIP radio, which the friend of mine who owns this lovely room and house, he introduced me to FIP radio, which is a French radio station, which is really eclectic and wonderful. So yeah, I love radio. I still listen to it a lot.
So maybe moving on to DJing a little bit more.
Yeah.
Around the time I think that Ministry was happening for you, you were also starting to get booked in a lot of those other spots up and down the UK, Progress, Room at the Top, Cream, places like that.
Yeah.
How did you find that as an experience?
Oh, it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing because at that time, my friends were all still going out a lot. So they were like coming with me to, up the M1 to Liverpool to play Cream or Gatecrasher in Sheffield or God's Kitchen in Birmingham or,
Passion.
Passion in Colville. They were coming with me, and it was amazing because I was playing alongside big DJs and I had all my mates with me, and it was great. And I loved it. It was the thing that kind of put me on the map for getting international bookings, for getting booking agents to want to represent me, to get me, touring internationally as well. It was amazing. It was fucking amazing.
And was it kind of like an education as well, starting to go to all of these kind of, maybe for the first time, I don't know, these kind of like towns, around the cities around the UK, seeing how the different tribes responded to different sets and different ways, types of music and things like that?
Definitely. I would just play my sound, and predominantly in the bigger places like Gatecrasher, Cream, God's Kitchen, etc., it rocked. But there were definitely some places where I got booked to play, and I played in the arse end of everywhere in this country. I've honestly played in places you've never even heard of, in shit clubs where, I've turned up to play my sound and it's just cleared the whole club because what they thought
they weren't ready for it,
or they had no idea who I was. So they probably called the booking agency and said, "Yeah, we want to book someone for this," and without doing any degree of investigation. So I've had, in that period where I was just hammering up and down the M1 every weekend, the M1 and the M6 was great. I loved it. you know, there were lots of other mates who were DJs who were doing the same thing, and we had some amazing times together, lots of partying, and you know, my wife was with me a lot of the time as well, so it was great. We were having a fucking great time. I loved it, but I did play some really, really shit gigs as well.
Inevitably so.
Yeah.
So your very first track was Simmer and John Askew Scissorhands / Krusty the Crown.
Yeah.
Krusty the Crown, which immediately, you know, kind of had that darker sound to it. Did you, you know, was that something you were just instinctively kind of drawn to, or do you think it was like, you know, because you'd come out of the rave scene and that was just generally a pretty hard and fast environment generally?
So that was on Shimmy Recordings, which was part of Shimmy, the club night in Bristol, which was run by a mate of mine called Simmer, who was big DJ in Bristol at the time, and amazing DJ. He was so fucking good. He it was all about, like, that Sasha Digweed and Laurent Garnier approach to DJing, where you're layering tracks for, you know, 3-4 minutes. He was really tight, really amazing. Track selection was brilliant, and his night was always sort of like harder acid trance and techno. But he, when we first met, he was sort of going more in a techno direction, and I was still kind of a bit more on the trance side, but also I love techno and I liked acid techno, the whole, you know, Stay Out Forever, Liberator DJs, Dave the Drummer, DDR, all those guys in London, Hazchem Records, all that shit. I loved Kinetic Records. And so he said, we decided to partner on setting up Shimmy Recordings, and that record was one of the first tracks we made. And we worked in his studio, which was in Bristol, which was, I loved working in that studio. I mean, it was just a cloud smoke of skunk, but
A creativity.
very creative, very great creative space. But we were just having so much fun. We're working on old Atari with just samplers. You know, it was all hardware. And yeah, those records were really organic, fast, hard, acid techno, essentially. And yeah, they still sound pretty good today. Yeah,
They do. And I mean, it wasn't 2 years after that we started to see tracks like Vellum and The Door kind of come through. So that was kind of quite a, you know, sea change between those two. So
yeah,
that, I guess, was where you were kind of coming into. What was the story behind that?
Well,
Where did that come
I had, so at Ministry of Sound, I was working in radio, and Ministry had an online digital radio station that was running 24 hours a day, and the radio studio itself was in my office, so you had to walk through my office to get to the radio studio. So every single artist and DJ that was booked to come and do a set on the radio station or to be interviewed or whatever had to walk through my office.
Through the John filter.
Yeah, it's true, right? So when you came into Ministry of Sound, the offices, you had, on the right-hand side, you had reception. On the left-hand side, you had my office, a big glass-fronted office. And some of the I had my own show on there, and I one of my heroes was a guy called Pablo Gargano, who had Eve Records and Teleca, and so I invited him in, and he was brilliant. He was on the show. He was such a lovely guy, and he said, "Well, why don't you just come down and hang out at my studio in Brixton?" And so I did, and we got.
This was the one on Cold Harbour Lane, was it?
Yeah. Well, no, I think his studio was called Cold Harbour Studios, but it wasn't on Cold Harbour Lane. It was more when you're looking down the Brixton High Street towards, you know, with the tube station on the right, and then there's the bridge, and you know further down there is the you know, as though you're on a Stockwell. You'd almost come out of the tube station, cross the road, and go left, and it was one street behind the high street on that side, even though Cold Harbour Lane was further up and that way. And so he said, come down to the studio, and I did, and we got caned, and we made Velica. He said, do you want to make a record and I'll engineer it? And I was like, yeah, fuck yeah. So we made Velica. He released it on Teleca, his label. Not Velica. We released a track called Vellum on Teleca, his label Teleca. It did really well. And they said, look, do you want to start your own label?
This is Steve Lopresti as well.
Stephen Lopresti and
Lovely guy.
Yeah, really nice guy. And they just welcomed me in, and we had some amazing times together. They were, you know, bear in mind, I was living in London. I had all my friends there, but I was also still, you know, keen to meet more people in the industry and immerse myself more in music. So meeting them and getting into that more underground acid trance scene was just fucking brilliant. And they just took me under their wing, let me start my own label, which they owned, but I was A&Ring it and I had the freedom to sign and get whatever music I want. So I started Discover Records with them, and we re-released Vellum with a new remix from Backbeat, and Backbeat was an alias for Pablo and me. And then went on to release loads of other stuff like The Door, Skylab. And it was a glorious period, but it was also right at the beginning of the death of vinyl.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, we started this too late.
How did you deal with the death of vinyl? Because it happened for trance, like that was the vanguard, wasn't it? That was the first genre that really, you know, the sales fell away. How did you deal with that personally and from an A&R perspective? How did you take it?
It was terrifying because at the time I was working in Ministry of Sound, a company who was, you know, outside of the club. The bulk of its income was from recordings, and it was panic. There was widespread panic. Records that were, you know, labels that were 1 month doing 15,000, 20,000 copies every single month was suddenly doing 1,400. The drop off was in the space of 4 or 5 months. It was crazy, and a lot of good artists, a lot of good labels, a lot of good producers disappeared at that time and never came back, and it was heartbreaking. But throughout my career, I've always been about, you know, whatever's new, whatever's coming in next. You've got to embrace it and go with it. I've always been about like new technology, new advances, new ways of consuming, streaming music. I'm all for it. And so even though it was annoying from the perspective of record labels paying me £3,000 to do a remix, down to suddenly you were having
300.
Or you'd have to do it for free because there was no money in it. When MP3s first started, it was fucked. There was nothing because DJs hadn't got their head round downloading files. They didn't understand it. You know, yes, some people were making records and burning them onto CD so that they could play it on those old, very primitive square Pioneer decks, in the hope that they would, you know, figure out whether the record was ready to cut into vinyl instead of spending 50, 60 quid cutting an acetate, which you used to have to. But
yeah, there were very few benefits and lots of pitfalls, wasn't there?
Lots of. Yeah. But yeah, it was a terrifying time for a lot of people. A lot of good people went down in that crash. But I wasn't one of them. I was like, yeah, fuck that, you know.
Well, you launched Discover Dark in that time, didn't you?
Yeah, Discover Dark, and we just embraced selling CDs. That was our new norm. And then it wasn't until much later that streaming and Spotify and Deezer and Apple and all these things started to come about. And now, when you look at now, it's and I know we're going to cover now later, but it's streaming and catalog acquisition and buying music and owning catalog is now, I would say, almost taking over from live.
Well, with the John Askew that we know in terms of the sound that you've, you know, held dear for the last kind of 30 years, Discover Dark, was that like in some way a kind of reaction to Discover? Was it like set up so that you could, you know, there was like a few years where, you know, Vellum was out and, you know, which were more melodic tracks.
Yeah.
But Discover Dark seemed to be more innate to you. Is that?
Yeah, it was like Discover was exactly that. It was a melodic trance label, and but as we've already covered in this conversation, I was still madly in love with percussive techno, a la early days of Drum Code, CJ Bolland, and I wanted an output for that. And obviously those guys were like, yeah, let's do it. We were still doing some vinyl, but you were having to readjust everything and work on the basis of selling 1,000 to 1,500 copies rather than the early days of selling shitloads. So Discover Dark was just like the underground techno, really techie, harder version of Discover. And then they ran side by side until I got the opportunity to work with Paul Oakenfold, and then I left and went and focused all my A&R stuff on Perfecto.
Oh, that was actually the next question.
Right, okay.
So how did that run?
Paul, we were signing Paul to the radio department. So by now I was working in the radio department, and we wanted to sign him to the radio department to do a weekly Perfecto radio show, which we would syndicate around the world. And I was playing at his weekly residency night in Las Vegas called Rain, a club called Rain. It's Planet Perfecto at Rain. And I played it, and then Paul came on after me, and he turned up with this entourage of people, and we said, hi, how are you? Great, and he was fucking shit. The music was appalling. It was dreadful. Honestly, it was so cheap. And this is a guy who I'd seen at Club UK in 1994 playing all that Perfecto Fluoro, Man with No Name stuff, and that early, like, really cutting edge music. And now he was just playing really cheap. It just sounded awful. It sounded dreadful. And I couldn't believe it. It was like one of my heroes. And yet this entourage were all around him, were like, yeah, like going for it. And I'm like, none of you know, number one, why this is bad, badly produced, badly executed music, but also the damage that this style of music, he'd been Americanized.
Yep.
And so I then saw him play twice more within a month, and I was like, fuck me, man, this is bad. So then I hatched a plan and drew out a plan of how I would manage him and turn his career around and win back favor with his core fan base. And I devised this plan, and I rehearsed my pitch to my wife 2 or 3 times. And then I arranged to have a meeting with Paul at his hotel. He was staying at the Soho Hotel in London, very lavish and incredible hotel. And I went to meet him there for lunch, and was nervous. And he'd had a big night out the night before, and I think he was feeling it. So he said, look, instead of us having lunch, why don't you just come up to my room? So I went up to his room, and, it's Paul Oakenfold. He's a fucking rock star, right? So I got to his room, and he thought I was coming there to continue the pitch conversation of him coming to work with the radio department. And instead, I said to him, look, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about me managing you. And I want you to allow me to talk for an hour maximum and explain to you why I will fucking absolutely rock it for you, and explain to you what my plan is and how I'm going to execute it. Wow. And at the end of it, right, I don't want you to give me any questions whatsoever. I want you to just take what I've said away with you, because I know you're going on tour to Latin America tomorrow. But also, here is a CD wallet with a set that I think you should play. I've just spent the last 3 weeks hunting for a, whatever year this was, 2010, a 2010 version of what I think you ought to be playing. And take this away, play this set while you're in Latin America. And if what I say to you resonates,
wow,
and if that set, speaks volumes to you, then call me and we'll talk more. And I spoke to him for about an hour. He didn't interrupt once. He didn't ask a single question. And at the end of it, he said, I love everything you've said to me. Gave him the CD wallet, left, walked out, felt really fucking high. I thought that went really well. And then he called me from a club in Brazil, or a festival in Brazil. He'd literally just come off stage. And because, I was telling him some pretty harsh truths. I said to him, I've seen you DJ 3 times in the last month, and I think you don't like DJing. I think you've fallen out of love of DJing. You don't like it. I think you've got an entourage of people around you who are encouraging you to play music that's fucking shit. And I think you need to take a step back, readdress what your core brand values are of Paul Oakenfold, and fucking just change lanes. Otherwise, it's over. Pretty bold things to come out of a little bloke he'd never fucking met, you know. So, but then he called me from this, coming straight off the decks, and he said, I'm in.
Wow.
He said
story.
that music that I've just played is fucking it. I'm in. We're doing it. And then when he got back from that tour, we had a meeting, and he said, right, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to fire about 3 or 4 people from your staff, because I just don't think they get it. I think you've been Americanized. I think, not that that's a bad thing to have an American influence, but I think it's alienated your core fan base, and it's fucking your trajectory. And so we worked together, and we had 3 utterly brilliant years of Paul flying again. It was amazing. And then towards the end of it, we started, he just was kind of starting to become really obsessed with like what Steve Aoki and stuff were doing, and wanted to go in that direction. And I was just like, mate, I think it's a terrible mistake, and I'm just going to have to resign because I can't endorse this. You're paying me a lot of money to come up with a plan, and then you're only doing 20% of it because you want to override the other part, to do something which I just don't want to have my name on.
I think that if that hadn't have happened, and I'd imagine that you look at it this way as well, around the time of the EDM explosion, you could, if you take that out of the equation, that probably would have brought about an entirely different history, and it would have been maybe 14 years instead of 4.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad we did part ways when we did, and I'm forever grateful to Paul because he's such an intelligent guy. When it comes to the actual business of music and how everything works, he's always got such a hunger to learn, and that is infectious. And he taught me a fuckload about the music industry, and I'm forever grateful to him for that. Love working with him, and when we parted ways as good friends. We remained good friends, and he was always so gracious and friendly, and he always took my wife and I out to amazing restaurants and sent her gifts, and he was just lovely. He was a lovely guy, and I'll forever be grateful for the time we worked together and for the things that we achieved, especially not only with his career but with Perfecto Records, which at the time was with a joint venture with Armada as well.
Yeah. So just stepping away from back to labels just for a second, one label that no longer exists that you would have loved to have released a record on, except RNS.
No Respect. Actually, Noom.
Right.
Noom Records. Although Noom does still exist, I think. So I'm going to say No Respect Records or Noom. One of those two.
Good stuff. So 2001 was the first time you played in Los Angeles. When was the year that international really started to take off for you?
2004, 5, 6, I would say, around about that period. It was really when I was playing a lot at the Gallery, and therefore the Creams and the Gate Crashers and God's Kitchens. That period was when I started getting booked to play international tour nights for Cream and Ministry of Sound. And
so where was that taking you?
Caracas in Venezuela,
Goodness.
Manila in the Philippines, Stockholm in Sweden, Ibiza, all over the place. I mean, not to the extent that it would really start to properly take off further towards, 2007, 8, 9, 10. That's when it really started to get going. And then just built up and up and up there to there. But I have to say, I don't know whether this is relevant to this question. Like when it got to 2016, 17, 18, 19, it started to get a little bit too much. And I have to say I was really grateful when COVID came along. I think I needed that break. Otherwise I could have potentially really burnt out.
Yeah, I think the first 6 months of COVID, everybody in the industry were, it was enforced holiday, wasn't it?
It was lovely. And the weather was superb. It was just, I loved it. But I really needed it as well.
Yeah. So tell us about the highest highs of artist management, and maybe just to balance the books, a lowest low.
The highest highs are working on records that are a huge success, like Joris's remix of Transmission, which is nearly at 40,000 streams. 40 million streams. Very nearly got a nomination for a Grammy. That was definitely a big high. The music itself is the biggest high. There are so many different layers to this job, and ultimately a lot of them take you down rabbit holes of administrative horse shit. But ultimately I am still here because of the music, and I adore the music, and that is the biggest high for me, is listening to the music. An artist that you manage, or an artist sending you a demo for a record label that you run, and that music blowing you out of the water, that blowing your fucking mind. That to me is the biggest high you can have. Or as an artist, no, that's not relevant to the question, John, but hearing that music in a club environment or a festival environment, and the place going bananas. That for me is still the highest of the high. The lowest of the low, I think, is the appalling bullshittery that goes on around social media. And by that I mean people allowing social media to determine what direction they go in as an artist, or as a producer or a musician, like changing your sound or your beliefs or your narrative, or your look or anything. If changing that according to not what's going on in here, but according to what you're seeing on fucking TikTok or Instagram, I think is a tragedy. And artists being obsessed with social media, being obsessed with the statistics, with the mental turmoil of whether people still like you because this post didn't get as many likes as this post. I think that is the biggest fucking travesty in electronic music, and it irritates the piss out of me.
So in your life, which year were you having the most fun, and which was your most serious year? Professional life.
Only professional?
Yeah.
Fuck, that's a tricky one. For a few reasons. Number one, my memory's shit. But I mean, 16, 17, 18, 19, when the touring was heavy, I did a lot of amazing gigs. But now, actually, I think it's probably better now, because in addition to all the amazing gigs you did in that heavy touring period, I did a lot of really shit ones as well. Whereas now I tend to only do good ones because I'm a lot more selective over what I say yes to. I'm happiest as an artist and more comfortable right now. That doesn't answer your question, does it?
Maybe put it in like a 5-year period. So say 90 to 95, 95 to 2000, 2005.
I just don't know. I would say 2016 to up to COVID was the busiest. And I would say the second year of COVID was the lowest. If you want to pick a 12-month period as opposed to a specific year, I would say end of October 2020, when the novelty of being on holiday had worn off, and you realised, oh my God, this isn't a 1-year situation. The live music world is actually going to be fucked for 2 years. When that had sunk in, then I was in the darkest place I think I've ever been in my life, except for when my brother died. From that sort of October, November, December 2020, for the next 8-9 months was fucking awful. I just couldn't get out of this angry frustration and funk.
Yeah. It's astonishing, isn't it, that those two periods are so kind of abutted to one another.
Yeah.
You know, you've got this 6-month period where it just
loved
feels
it.
extraordinary.
I
And as you
loved it.
say, that the sun, someone turned the sun on and it was incredible. And then the reality of the situation kind of sets in, and it became the worst.
Yeah, it was so bad.
So I'm just going to read this question verbatim. Are you a frustrated clothing designer trapped inside the body of a DJ?
Possibly.
How much of it do you do yourself, or
Well,
oversee artistically?
I sketch out the ideas in a very primitive shit fashion, and then I hand them over with an explanation to a designer who's way more proficient than me, and then he knocks my shit ideas into shape. So I'd say it's a team effort, but...
And how does it feel seeing those ideas kind of like come into physical form?
I love it. Yeah. I love it. And I think it's an integral part of my label 7.
Was that the desire from the front end of 7 to actually kind of have those two, or did it come into frame?
I think merchandise is an important part of being an artist. You know, from the fan perspective, you know, I want to wear my Guns N' Roses t-shirt with pride. You know, I love Guns N' Roses. I want people to know that I love Guns N' Roses, right? If I'm going to a rock festival with 10 bands on, I'll go with the Queens of the Stone Age t-shirt that says I'm here for them, right? So I think it's important to give your fans and followers an opportunity to wear your colours, their colours, with pride. And I think it's also
and in a stylish fashion.
In a stylish fashion, and also gives you an opportunity to expand on the brand's narrative. You know, there are messages and there is a look that people have obviously endorsed into by buying and wearing this stuff.
So the only other question that I have left, it is a question of sorts. I've just got down bum stuff here. So now there seems to be, looking back at some of your previous interviews, kind of quite an interest around the area. There was one story with your wife. There was another video I watched which seemed to have your good. And there was another video I watched. I think it was for Tooth Decay, where you appeared to be having like a sticker. Was it a Stadium Records, a Stadium Artist sticker slapped onto your backside by? Look, it might have been Simon Patterson. I'm not sure.
Actually, that was not onto my backside. It was onto a friend of ours, Tom's backside, who very tragically took his life a few months ago, or like 6 weeks ago. He took all his clothes off in a hotel in Las Vegas and covered himself in stickers, in 7 branded stickers.
What a trooper!
Yeah, I mean he was 7 through and through.
Okay, well I looked at this, and through my lens, I thought to myself that this must be Simon Patterson's kind of like the revenge that he got to extract on you for his speech at the end of Tuesday Tooth Decay,
Yeah.
whereby he was ranting at you for, I think, leaving a state of trance 850. Was that the...
Yeah, that's
anyway.
yeah.
So, is there anything
you've heard
that's
that
right.
subliminal?
I have. Okay.
Wow,
Well,
that's
that wasn't
amazing.
you. I left that one to the end because I just thought, well, we can cut that one off nice and easy.
Well,
It doesn't go in a...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I want to repeat the story about the thing with my wife, but
Maybe we'll put a little box link to. Yeah,
it's well documented.
Yeah.
It's out there, but
I wouldn't want to steal from Victor's canon in that respect. You
Yeah.
know, but we'll link to it.
yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, well that's us done for
Part
part
one.
one.